February 18, 1944. 11 o'clock in the morning. On a snow-dusted airfield in southern England, 19 de Havilland Mosquito bombers prepared to attempt what many called impossible. A precision strike on a fortified prison in the heart of German-occupied France, flying at an altitude so low that a moment's distraction meant death, all to save men and women whose very existence threatened to unravel the most critical military secret of the war. The air that morning carried the weight of desperate calculation. In Amiens, a gray medieval city 100 kilometers north of Paris, behind thick stone walls built to contain criminals in the time of Napoleon, sat a prison now transformed into a Nazi holding pen for the French resistance. Inside cell after frigid cell, 832 human beings waited, some for interrogation, some for deportation to concentration camps, some for the firing squad that had already claimed 12 of their comrades in December. Among them sat Raymond Vivant, the sous-prefect of Abbeville, a man whose mind contained a detailed map of the Allied invasion plans for Normandy, the location of every remaining resistance cell in northern France, and the names of hundreds of operatives ready to rise when the liberating armies arrived. He had been arrested just 4 days earlier, on February 14th. The clock was ticking, not in days but in hours. British intelligence calculated that the Gestapo interrogators, relentless and methodical, would break through his defenses within a week, perhaps less. When they did, the entire architecture of Operation Overlord D-Day itself would be compromised. This was the desperate problem facing Allied commanders in London and Washington in the frigid winter of early 1944. The French resistance in northern France, which had taken years to build, was collapsing. The Gestapo's winter offensive of 1943 to 1944 had been devastatingly effective. The arrest of Roland Farjon, a senior figure in the Organisation Civile et Militaire in late 1943, had triggered a cascade of captures. The OCM alone claimed a membership of 100,000 men and women, including about 12,000 in the Amiens region. Networks with codenames like Alliance and Socies, painstakingly constructed spy rings funded and directed by Britain's Secret Intelligence Service and the American Office of Strategic Services, were being systematically dismantled. Dominique Ponchardier, a resistance leader who maintained contact with London, watched in anguish as his colleagues disappeared one by one into Amiens Prison. The statistics were grim. By mid-February, more than 100 resistance members were imprisoned in Amiens alone, and German intelligence had scheduled mass executions for February 19th, just 1 day away. The intelligence apparatus that would guide Allied paratroopers on D-Day, sabotage German communications, and prevent Wehrmacht reinforcements from reaching the beaches of Normandy was about to be decapitated. The stakes transcended the lives of individual prisoners, though those lives were precious enough. Raymond Vivant had spent the war building an information-gathering system of remarkable sophistication. French civilians across the Channel coast, farmers, shopkeepers, village mayors, observed German coastal defenses, counted artillery pieces, noted the positions of tank divisions, and passed their intelligence through a network of couriers to Vivant, who transmitted it by wireless to London. This was the granular intelligence that allowed Allied planners to understand exactly what defenses they would face when the invasion came. Vivant also held detailed knowledge of a plan to reorganize the resistance and expand it tenfold in the weeks before D-Day, transforming it from an intelligence-gathering network into a guerrilla army capable of disrupting German communications and supply lines at the critical moment. His capture, as one MI6 assessment coldly noted, threatened damage that would be incalculable. 2 American spies and a British agent were also held in the prison, recent arrivals whose capture suggested that German counterintelligence was becoming more sophisticated, more successful. William J. Donovan, the legendary head of the Office of Strategic Services, personally contacted Stuart Menzies, chief of MI6, requesting immediate action. The message was forwarded to the War Cabinet. This was not merely a rescue mission, it was an attempt to prevent a strategic catastrophe. The solution that emerged from this crisis was as radical as it was improbable, and it bore the unmistakable stamp of one man's audacity. Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry, commander of 2 Group, RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force, had spent the war pioneering the art of precision low-level bombing, an approach dismissed by many senior officers as suicidal. Conventional wisdom in the Royal Air Force held that bombing accuracy required altitude, that aircraft needed height to aim effectively, and to protect themselves from ground fire. Embry had proven otherwise. He understood that the Mosquito, that magnificent fusion of British engineering brilliance and plywood, possessed capabilities that rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. Fast enough to outrun most German fighters, agile enough to maneuver at treetop level, and equipped with a bomb load that could demolish a building, the Mosquito could do what heavy bombers could not, hit a specific target with surgical precision. But even for Mosquito crews, what Embry proposed was extraordinary. The target was not a factory or a rail yard, broad expanses where a near miss still inflicted damage. It was a prison, a structure surrounded by civilian homes in a densely populated city, where the objective was not destruction but liberation. The bombers would need to breach the outer walls to allow prisoners to escape, while simultaneously destroying the guards' quarters to prevent them from stopping the escape or massacring prisoners in their cells. They would need to avoid hitting the cell blocks themselves, where hundreds of innocent people were locked behind doors they could not open. And they would need to do all of this at an altitude so low that anti-aircraft fire became irrelevant because the aircraft would be below the minimum depression angle of German guns, but also at an altitude where a single mistake, a moment's miscalculation, meant flying directly into a stone wall. The architect of this seemingly impossible plan was not a staff officer drawing lines on maps from the safety of an operations room. It was Group Captain Percy Charles Pickard, one of the most celebrated pilots in the Royal Air Force, a man whose face had appeared in British propaganda films, whose courage was attested by a Distinguished Service Order with 2 bars and a Distinguished Flying Cross. Pickard was 28 years old, though his combat experience made him seem older. He had flown bombers in the early, desperate days of the war, when the RAF sent Wellingtons and Whitleys into the night sky over Germany knowing that many would not return. He had commanded 161 Special Duty Squadron, the clandestine unit that flew Lysander light aircraft into occupied France under cover of darkness, landing in fields illuminated only by flashlights held by resistance members, to deliver agents and extract Allied personnel from under the noses of the Gestapo. RAF historian Chris Ward observed that Pick knew only how to lead from the front, and the statistics supported this. In the 8 months before Pickard took command of 161 Squadron, the unit had completed 10 successful Lysander operations. In Pickard's first 3 months, they completed 11. His personal flying log recorded dozens of missions deep into occupied territory, navigating by moonlight and memory, landing on improvised airstrips where a wrong field or a betrayal meant capture and execution. Hugh Verity, one of his officers, remarked with wry admiration to his wife, "I am being restrained from personal effort by Pick, who thinks I have been hogging. I like that, coming from him, the biggest hog of the lot." Pickard brought this intensity of commitment to Operation Jericho. When the plan was proposed in early February, he immediately volunteered not merely to command the mission but to fly it himself, to lead the formation into France and to orbit over the target, coordinating the attack in real time. His superiors questioned whether the commander of 140 Wing should risk himself on such a hazardous operation. Pickard's response was characteristically direct. His men would follow him anywhere, but they would follow him more readily if he shared their risks. The technical challenges alone would have deterred a less determined man. The approach route to Amiens would require flying across the English Channel at wavetop height to avoid German radar, then navigating across enemy-occupied territory using only visual landmarks, church steeples, roads, rivers, while maintaining formation and evading flak positions. The weather in February was notoriously unpredictable. Cloud cover, snow squalls, or fog could scatter the formation or obscure the target entirely, and the timing had to be precise. Intelligence indicated that the prison guards ate lunch at noon, gathering in their mess hall, presenting a brief window when they were concentrated in one location rather than dispersed throughout the prison. The attack would need to arrive at exactly 12:01 p.m., hit the walls first to create escape routes, then strike the guards' quarters to neutralize resistance, all within a matter of minutes. The battle of development for Operation Jericho was not fought in laboratories or proving grounds, but in the urgent collection of intelligence and the meticulous construction of an attack plan. Dominique Ponchardier, the resistance leader in Amiens, had been sending detailed reports to London since late 1943. These messages, transmitted by wireless and at enormous personal risk, every transmission could be detected by German direction-finding equipment, provided a blueprint of the prison. The layout of the walls, the location of the guard towers, the thickness of the stone barriers, the position of the German-administered section where the most valuable prisoners were held, the duty rosters that showed when guards changed shifts, the routines of the prison administration. British intelligence officers pored over reconnaissance photographs, analyzing shadows to determine wall heights, counting windows to estimate the number of cells. MI9 and MISX, the Allied organizations dedicated to escape and evasion, contributed their expertise on prison security and escape procedures. A three-dimensional model of the prison was constructed for the aircrew briefing, showing every building, every wall, every approach route. The planners faced agonizing calculations. If the bombs hit the cell blocks directly, they would kill the prisoners they were trying to save. If the bombs merely damaged the walls without breaching them completely, the prisoners would remain trapped and the guards would have time to organize either a recapture operation or, more horrifically, a massacre. The bombs needed to strike with sufficient force to blow open the walls and spring the cell doors, but without causing the buildings to collapse. This required not just accuracy in targeting but precision in bomb selection. The planners chose 500-pound bombs fitted with 11-second delayed action fuses, designed to penetrate the walls before exploding, directing the blast force outward rather than inward. The aircrew selected for the mission represented the elite of RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force. 18 Mosquito FB MKVs were assigned, drawn from 3 squadrons. 6 from No. 487 Squadron RNZAF, commanded by Wing Commander Irving Black Smith. 6 from No. 464 Squadron RAAF, led by Wing Commander Bob Iredale, and 6 from 21 Squadron RAF under Wing Commander Ivor Daddy Dale. The New Zealanders of 487 Squadron would strike first, targeting the eastern and northern walls. The Australians of 464 Squadron would follow, attacking the main prison buildings and the guards' quarters. The RAF's 21 Squadron would serve as a reserve force, held back unless the first 2 waves failed, with orders to bomb the prison comprehensively if the walls remained intact. A final, desperate option that would kill many prisoners but would at least prevent the Gestapo from extracting their secrets. These men were not novices. They were combat veterans who had flown countless missions over France, attacking V-1 rocket sites, railroad marshalling yards, and German military installations. They understood the Mosquito's capabilities and limitations intimately. Yet what they were being asked to do was unprecedented. Flying Officer Tony Wickham later recalled the briefing, describing the collective intake of breath when the mission details were revealed, the realization that they would be flying lower than they had ever flown in combat, with zero margin for error. The unofficial motto that emerged was stark: get in, get the job done, get out, and hope to God the Germans are at lunch. Yet even as Allied planners finalized their audacious scheme, they remained ignorant of a crucial fact, one that would later fuel debate about the mission's necessity and morality. The enemy's fatal blind spot in this case was not arrogance or technological deficiency, but rather the fog of war itself, the imperfect intelligence that plagues both sides in any conflict. The belief that 100 prisoners were scheduled for execution on February 19th, while plausible given the Gestapo's brutal methods, has been challenged by post-war historians who found no German documents confirming mass executions for that specific date. The intelligence that drove the mission's urgency, that Raymond, Vivant, and others would be shot within days, may have been based on assumption rather than intercepted orders. This uncertainty does not diminish the genuine crisis facing the resistance, nor does it erase the fact that 12 resistance members had already been executed at Amiens in December, establishing a horrifying precedent. But it reveals a profound irony. The operation was launched under the pressure of an imminent deadline that may not have existed. The German administration at Amiens Prison, while certainly part of the occupation apparatus, was primarily staffed by French officials working under German supervision. Many of these guards were not SS ideologues but bureaucrats navigating the moral compromises of occupation. The German intelligence officers interrogating resistance prisoners were following their own timelines, methodically extracting information, unaware that British and American intelligence had already concluded that time had run out. The true blind spot, then, was mutual. The Allies did not know the Germans' precise intentions, and the Germans had no idea that a strike force of Mosquito bombers was being readied to demolish their prison. The reversal, the moment when theory collided with reality, when planning gave way to action, began shortly before 11 o'clock on the morning of February 18, 1944. 19 Mosquitoes roared down runways in England and climbed into a gray winter sky before descending to wavetop height over the English Channel. The weather was atrocious, with squalls and poor visibility scattering the tight formations. Pilots fought to maintain visual contact with their wingmen through sheets of rain and snow, the sea barely visible as a gray blur beneath their wings. The Mosquito's wooden construction, which made it lighter and faster than metal aircraft, also made it more vulnerable to icing. Frost accumulating on wings could disrupt airflow and send the aircraft tumbling into the channel. They flew at 250 miles per hour, the aircraft vibrating with the roar of twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, so low that spray from the waves misted their windscreens. For the men inside, pilot and navigator crammed into a cockpit barely wider than their shoulders. This was flying at its most intense, every sense focused on the horizon, on the altimeter, on the position of the aircraft ahead. Behind the bombers came 12 Hawker Typhoons of 174, 198, and 245 squadrons, heavy fighter bombers tasked with fending off German interceptors and suppressing flak positions around Amiens. As they crossed the French coast, conditions improved. The weather cleared, visibility extended, and the formations reassembled. Now the landscape below transformed from the impersonal gray of the Channel to the intimate geography of occupied France. Villages, fields, roads, all sliding past at terrifying speed. The pilots navigated by landmarks, following the Amiens Road, a ribbon of gray that led directly to their target. At this altitude, the war became personal. People on the ground could see the RAF roundels on the wings, could hear the distinctive howl of Merlin engines, could sometimes even see the faces of the pilots. French civilians waved. German soldiers dove for cover or ran for anti-aircraft guns. The Mosquitoes swept over the countryside at what the official reports described as less than 5 meters above the ground. 15 feet, the height of a single-story building, an altitude at which a gentle rise in terrain became an obstacle, at which power lines were deadly hazards, at which there was no room for hesitation or second-guessing. At 12:01 p.m., exactly on schedule despite the challenging flight, the lead aircraft of 487 Squadron reached Amiens Prison. Wing Commander Irving Black Smith led his formation in from the northeast, following the Albert Road as it curved toward the city. 3 of his aircraft peeled off toward the eastern and northern walls, the bombardiers in Mosquitoes. The pilot himself triggered the bombs, sighting on the gray stone barriers that enclosed the prison yard. The bombs fell, 11-second fuses counting down as the Mosquitoes roared overhead and banked away. The delayed detonations meant the aircraft were clear before the explosions, reducing the risk of being hit by debris from their own ordnance. When the bombs detonated, the concussive force was visible from miles away. Plumes of gray dust and smoke erupting from the prison walls, masonry flying outward, sections of the ancient stone barriers collapsing into rubble. Inside the prison, the noise was overwhelming, a physical assault of sound that stunned prisoners and guards alike. The concussion waves rippled through cell blocks, and miraculously, the blast pressure sprang locks on cell doors. Prisoners, some of whom had been awaiting execution, others who had endured weeks of interrogation and torture, staggered out of their cells into corridors filled with dust and confusion, scarcely believing that the walls had been breached, that escape might be possible. But the first wave had not completed the mission. 2 aircraft from 487 Squadron diverted to bomb the Amiens railway station, a calculated strike designed to delay German reinforcements. The attack succeeded brilliantly, blocking rail lines and forcing German troops to come by road, buying the escaping prisoners a critical 2-hour head start. Meanwhile, the remaining Mosquitoes of 487 Squadron circled for a second pass. Observers noted that the eastern wall, despite the first attack, appeared intact at 12:06 p.m. 2 aircraft from 464 Squadron, the Australian unit, dove toward the wall again, descending to 50 feet, 15 meters, and released 8 500-pound bombs directly at the base of the fortification. At that altitude, the margin for error was measured in seconds. A delayed pull-up meant flying into the explosion of your own bombs. Too early a release and the bombs would skip over the target. The Australian pilots held their nerve, released at the precise moment, and pulled up into a climbing turn as their bombs struck home. This time the eastern wall shattered completely, creating a gaping breach through which prisoners could see the streets of Amiens. Freedom, a chance at survival. Simultaneously, 2 Mosquitoes from 464 Squadron attacked the main prison building from an altitude of 100 feet, targeting the guards' quarters with another 8 500-pound bombs. The timing was crucial: noon, the lunch hour, when intelligence suggested maximum guard presence in the mess hall. The bombs struck with devastating accuracy. The guardhouse disintegrated in a maelstrom of fire and splintering wood, killing or disabling the occupants. The explosion tore through the mess hall where French and German personnel had been eating, transforming a moment of routine into carnage. This brutal calculus, killing guards to save prisoners, was the dark arithmetic of the operation. Among the 102 people who died in the raid were not just guards but also prisoners struck by bombs or falling masonry, innocents caught in the violence of their own liberation. The wounded numbered 74, men and women bleeding in the rubble, some trapped beneath collapsed walls. Group Captain Pickard orbited above the prison at 500 feet, his Mosquito circling the target while he assessed the damage through the smoke and dust. From his vantage point, he could see prisoners pouring through the breached walls, running across the prison yard toward the gaps in the perimeter, scattering into the streets of Amiens. The mission was succeeding. The walls were down, the guards were neutralized, and people were escaping. Pickard made the decision that 21 Squadron, the reserve force, was not needed. He transmitted the code to Wing Commander Ivor, Daddy Dale. Red, red, red. The signal to break off the attack and return to base. Dale's 6 Mosquitoes, loaded with bombs intended for a comprehensive destruction of the prison if the first waves failed, banked away from Amiens and headed back toward England. Their bombs would not be needed. The price of that success was already being calculated on the ground, where 258 prisoners ran through the streets, some still in prison clothing, some wounded, all desperate. Among them were 50 members of the French resistance, including 12 who had been scheduled for execution. Raymond Vivant, the man whose capture had triggered the entire operation, was among the escapees. For the Allied intelligence services, this alone justified the mission. Vivant's knowledge remained secure, the invasion plans protected, the resistance networks given a chance to rebuild. But the reversal had not yet reached its bitter conclusion. As the Mosquitoes turned north toward the coast, flying at low altitude and reduced speed, they had burned fuel and expended bombs, changing their aircraft's performance characteristics. German fighters appeared in the sky. Focke-Wulf 190s of 7/Jagdgeschwader 26, alerted by the explosions and the sight of RAF bombers over Amiens, dove toward the withdrawing aircraft. The Typhoon escorts engaged, and a swirling dogfight erupted in the skies north of the city. The Mosquitoes, designed as fast bombers rather than dogfighters, were vulnerable. They could not outturn the German fighters. Their best defense was speed, but they were already low on fuel, unable to push their engines to maximum power for long. For miles north of Amiens, disaster struck. A Focke-Wulf 190, flown by a pilot from JG-26, positioned itself behind Group Captain Pickard's Mosquito. Pickard was flying low, encumbered by the weight of his aircraft, unable to dive away from the threat because he was already near ground level. The German pilot opened fire. Cannon shells ripped into the Mosquito's tail section, severing control surfaces. Pickard's aircraft, mortally wounded, nosed down and struck the ground near the village of St. Gratien. Both Pickard and his navigator, Flight Lieutenant Alan Broadley, were killed instantly. French farmers who witnessed the crash rushed to the wreckage but found both men already dead. They removed the identification tags and decorations from the bodies, hiding them to prevent the Germans from claiming trophies, an act of respect for the men who had just risked everything to strike at the occupation. The cost continued to mount. Flying Officer J.E. Renault, flying a Typhoon escort from 174 Squadron at low altitude, heard a loud bang. His engine had been hit, possibly by ground fire or debris from the aerial combat. With his propeller windmilling to a stop, he crash-landed at Poulenville and was captured by German troops. Another Mosquito, flown by Flight Lieutenant Ian McCritchie, was shot down 30 miles west of Amiens. The pilot survived and evaded capture, but his navigator, Flight Sergeant R.W. Sampson, was killed. By the time the surviving aircraft landed back in England shortly after 1 p.m., the human toll was clear: 3 aircrew dead, 3 captured, 2 Mosquitoes destroyed, 2 Typhoons lost. For the RAF, these were grievous losses, made more painful by the death of Pickard, whose leadership and courage had made him a symbol of British defiance. On the ground in Amiens, the aftermath unfolded in chaos and opportunity. Of the 258 prisoners who escaped through the breached walls, 182 were recaptured within 48 hours. The 2-hour delay created by the bombing of the railway station gave escapees a head start, but German troops, French collaborationist police, and Gestapo agents flooded the area, setting up roadblocks, searching homes, questioning civilians. Some escapees were betrayed by informers. Others were simply unlucky, caught in random sweeps. Yet 73 prisoners evaded recapture entirely. These men and women disappeared into the French countryside, aided by sympathetic civilians, sheltered by remaining resistance networks, hidden in barns and cellars and attics until the Allies landed in Normandy 4 months later. For those 73, Operation Jericho was an unambiguous salvation. They lived because 19 Mosquitoes had flown at suicidal altitude and demolished the walls of their prison. Among them were intelligence operatives whose knowledge was invaluable, experienced resistance fighters who would return to the underground war, and ordinary people whose only crime had been opposition to occupation. The expansion and multi-role impact of Operation Jericho extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. The raid demonstrated that precision low-level bombing could achieve objectives that high-altitude strategic bombing could not. Throughout 1944, as the Allied air forces prepared for D-Day, Mosquito squadrons were increasingly tasked with similar missions: pinpoint strikes on specific targets where collateral damage had to be minimized or where the target was too small for heavy bombers. The techniques developed for Operation Jericho, ultra-low approach, precise timing, coordinated waves attacking different target elements, became standard doctrine for 2-group RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force. The psychological impact was equally significant. For the French resistance, the raid proved that London had not forgotten them, that the British would take extraordinary risks to protect their agents and allies. Dominique Ponchardier, who had requested the mission and provided the intelligence that made it possible, later wrote that the raid transformed morale across the resistance networks of northern France. It sent an unmistakable message. The Allies were coming, and when they arrived, they would bring not just armies but a commitment to those who had fought in the shadows. For French civilians who witnessed the raid, and thousands did, watching from windows and streets as Mosquitoes roared overhead at rooftop height, seeing the prison walls explode, hearing the thunder of bombs and engines, it was a visceral demonstration that Allied power was growing, that the occupation would not last forever. The German response revealed both operational effectiveness and strategic myopia. Immediately after the raid, German security forces launched a massive manhunt, flooding Amiens and the surrounding region with troops. The recapture of 182 escaped prisoners within 2 days demonstrated the Gestapo's efficiency and ruthlessness. Yet, at the strategic level, German intelligence failed to grasp the significance of what had occurred. They understood that the British had bombed the prison, but they did not comprehend why. Post-war records show no indication that German analysts realized the raid had been specifically designed to prevent the interrogation of Raymond Vivant and to protect the secrets of the impending invasion. In their assessment, it was simply an act of Allied terror bombing or a morale operation. This blindness, this failure to ask why the British would risk valuable aircraft and experienced crews on a prison raid, represented a profound intelligence failure. Had they understood the true motive, they might have accelerated interrogations, might have realized that Vivant held information of immense strategic value, might have extracted his secrets before he escaped. Instead, they treated the raid as an aberration, a tactical nuisance, and moved on to other concerns. Vivant remained free, his knowledge intact, and the plans for D-Day remained secure. The psychological aftermath reverberated through both Allied and German ranks. For RAF crews, Pickard's death was a profound blow. He had been not merely a commander but an inspiration, a man who led from the front and shared every risk he asked his men to take. Hugh Verity, his friend and fellow pilot, wrote that Pickard's loss struck us like a physical blow, leaving a void that could not be filled. Yet even in grief, There was recognition that he had died doing what he believed necessary, leading a mission designed to save lives. The memorial service held for Pickard and Broadley was attended by senior RAF officers and government officials, a tribute to their sacrifice and to the strategic importance of Operation Jericho. For the Mosquito crews who survived, the mission became a defining moment, proof that their aircraft and their skills could accomplish the impossible. The legend of the Wooden Wonder, the Mosquito's nickname, was enhanced by Amiens, adding another chapter to a remarkable combat record. For the French prisoners who escaped and evaded recapture, the psychological impact was transformative. These were men and women who had been facing execution or deportation to concentration camps, who had endured interrogation and torture, who had watched fellow prisoners shot in the prison yard. The sudden violence of the raid, the walls exploding, the guards killed or scattered, the possibility of escape, it was a reprieve from death, a second chance at life. Post-war testimonies from survivors described the confusion and terror of the bombing, the horror of seeing fellow prisoners killed by the explosions, but also the overwhelming gratitude for the opportunity to escape. One survivor, whose name has been lost to history but whose testimony was recorded by French historians, described running through the breached wall, expecting at any moment to be shot by guards or cut down by machine gun fire, and then realizing that the guards were dead or wounded, that the way was clear, that freedom was possible. "I ran until my lungs burned," he recalled. "And even then I kept running, because I knew men had died to give me this chance, and I would not waste it." The enduring legacy of Operation Jericho is complex, woven from strands of heroism, tragedy, moral ambiguity, and strategic calculation. In the immediate military sense, the operation was a success. It disrupted the Gestapo's dismantling of the French resistance in northern France, preserved critical intelligence regarding the D-Day invasion, and freed 50 resistance members who returned to the underground war. Raymond Vivant's escape alone justified the mission in the eyes of Allied intelligence. His knowledge of invasion plans and resistance networks was too valuable to risk falling into German hands. Yet the cost was significant. 102 dead in the prison, including both guards and prisoners, 3 RAF aircrew killed, 3 captured. The loss of Pickard, a commander whose experience and leadership could not be easily replaced. The moral calculus is haunting. A deliberate attack on a prison that killed prisoners in order to save other prisoners, an operation launched under the pressure of an execution deadline that may not have existed, a raid that succeeded tactically but at a human cost that can never be fully balanced against the lives saved. In the decades after the war, Operation Jericho became a symbol of Allied daring and precision, inspiring films like 633 Squadron and Mosquito Squadron that dramatized the raid for popular audiences. These cinematic portrayals emphasized the heroism and sacrifice of the aircrew, often simplifying the complexity of the operation and eliding the moral ambiguities. Historians have debated the mission's necessity, with some arguing that the intelligence about imminent executions was flawed, that the raid killed as many prisoners as it saved, and that alternative approaches, negotiations, bribes to corrupt guards, smaller-scale escape attempts, might have been less violent. Others counter that in the context of February 1944, with the invasion of Europe imminent and the entire resistance structure in jeopardy, decisive action was essential, that the risks of inaction outweighed the costs of the raid. The debate will likely never be fully resolved, because it requires weighing lives against lives, certain deaths against probable deaths, tactical success against moral complexity. What remains indisputable is the extraordinary courage of the men who flew Operation Jericho. To pilot a Mosquito at 50 feet above the ground, navigating by visual landmarks, releasing bombs at a target surrounded by civilian homes, all while flying through the smoke of your own explosions and knowing that German fighters might appear at any moment. This required skill and bravery of the highest order. Group Captain Pickard's decision to lead the mission personally, to orbit over the target at 500 feet while coordinating the attack, demonstrated a form of leadership that inspired his men even as it cost him his life. The New Zealand and Australian crews of 487 and 464 squadrons, many of whom had volunteered to serve in the RAF from the opposite side of the world, proved once again that the defense of freedom was a global endeavor, that men from distant nations would risk everything to strike at tyranny wherever it took root. The technical legacy of the mission shaped RAF doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The success of ultra-low-level precision bombing at Amiens validated the tactics that two groups had been developing since 1943. Mosquito squadrons were increasingly tasked with missions that required pinpoint accuracy, attacking Gestapo headquarters buildings, destroying specific railway bridges, hitting V-1 and V-2 rocket facilities. The marriage of the Mosquito's speed and maneuverability with the skill of elite aircrews created a capability that the Germans struggled to counter. Fast enough to evade most interceptors, flying too low for radar detection or heavy flak, the Mosquito became the weapon of choice for missions where precision mattered more than payload. This doctrine carried forward into the Cold War era, influencing the development of low-level attack aircraft and precision-guided munitions. The modern emphasis on surgical strikes and minimizing collateral damage can trace a lineage back to operations like Jericho, where the challenge was not simply to destroy, but to destroy the right targets while sparing others mere meters away. For the French people, particularly those in the Amiens region, Operation Jericho became a story told and retold, passed down through generations. The image of RAF Mosquitoes roaring over the rooftops at impossible speed, the sound of walls exploding, the sight of prisoners running through the streets, these became part of the collective memory of the occupation and liberation. The raid represented a moment when the distant war, usually experienced through news broadcasts and German communiques, became immediate and tangible, when Allied power manifested not as distant bomber streams at night, but as twin-engine aircraft you could almost touch, flown by men who were willing to risk their lives in daylight to save French civilians. Post-war, the French government recognized the significance of the operation. Memorials were erected, ceremonies held, survivors honored. The British and Commonwealth aircrew who died in the raid were commemorated in French military cemeteries, their graves tended by local communities who understood that these men had died fighting for France's freedom. The strategic dimension of Operation Jericho, its role in preserving the security of D-Day, cannot be overstated. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, succeeded in part because the Germans did not know exactly where or when the Allies would land, and because the French resistance was able to disrupt German communications and transportation in the critical hours after the landings began. Raymond Vivant's knowledge, kept from German interrogators by his escape from Amiens, remained secure. The resistance networks he had helped build, though damaged by the Gestapo offensive, survived to play their part in the liberation. When Allied paratroopers dropped into Normandy in the early hours of D-Day, they were met by French guides who led them away from German positions. When Allied infantry pushed inland from the beaches, they found bridges demolished by resistance saboteurs, communications lines cut, German reinforcements delayed by ambushes and blocked roads. This was the payoff of Operation Jericho. Not just the lives saved on February 18, 1944, but the operational capabilities preserved for the months that followed. The human dimension of the mission, the individual stories of prisoners who escaped, adds depth to the strategic narrative. Among the 73 who evaded recapture were people whose names have largely been lost to history, ordinary French citizens who had committed the extraordinary act of resisting occupation. Some were couriers who had carried messages between resistance cells, risking arrest every time they boarded a train with secret documents hidden in their clothing. Some were saboteurs who had cut telephone lines or damaged machinery in factories producing goods for the German war effort. Some were simply people who had sheltered Allied airmen shot down over France, or who had passed intelligence to underground networks. For these individuals, the weeks before Operation Jericho had been a descent into hell. Arrest, interrogation, the constant fear of torture or execution, the knowledge that they had been betrayed by someone they trusted. The raid offered them a second life, a chance to return to the fight or simply to survive the war and see their families again. Post-war interviews with survivors reveal a common theme: profound gratitude toward the RAF crews who risked everything, and profound sorrow for those prisoners who died in the raid. The survivors' guilt was real. Why did I live when others died? Why did the bombs miss my cell but hit the one next door? What right do I have to this reprieve? But so was the determination to honor the sacrifice by living fully, by continuing the resistance, by ensuring that France would be free. The controversy surrounding Operation Jericho, particularly the question of whether mass executions were actually scheduled for February 19th, emerged decades after the war, when historians gained access to German archives and found no confirmation of the intelligence that had driven the mission's urgency. This discovery has led some to question whether the raid was necessary, whether the Allies acted on flawed information, whether the deaths of 102 people in the prison could have been avoided if British intelligence had been more accurate. These are legitimate questions, but they must be evaluated in the context of February 1944, not with the benefit of post-war hindsight. The Gestapo had executed 12 resistance members at Amiens in December. This was documented fact, not speculation. The pattern of arrests and interrogations suggested an escalating German offensive against the resistance, one that threatened the entire network. Raymond Vivant had been captured holding information that could compromise the invasion. This was known with certainty. In that environment, with incomplete information and enormous stakes, Allied commanders made a decision to act rather than wait, to attempt a rescue that might save critical intelligence and critical lives, even at significant cost. Whether that decision was correct remains debatable, but it was not irrational or unjustified given what was known at the time. The legacy of the de Havilland Mosquito itself was enhanced by Operation Jericho. The wooden wonder, constructed largely of plywood and balsa wood at a time when metal was scarce, had proven itself in countless roles: night fighter, bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, pathfinder. The Amiens raid demonstrated yet another capability: precision strike at ultra-low altitude against fortified targets in urban environments. The aircraft's wooden construction, initially questioned by skeptics who doubted that wood could withstand combat stresses, proved to be an advantage. Wood was lighter than metal, giving the Mosquito a superior power-to-weight ratio and enabling its remarkable speed and maneuverability. The construction techniques also meant that Mosquitoes could be built in furniture factories by craftsmen who had no experience with aircraft manufacturing, distributing production across Britain and making the aircraft less vulnerable to German bombing raids on major aircraft plants. The success at Amiens added to the Mosquito's reputation, ensuring that it would remain in production and in service throughout the war and into the post-war period. For the pilots and navigators of 140 Wing who survived the mission, the memory of February 18, 1944, remained vivid for the rest of their lives. In reunions and interviews decades later, they spoke of the tension of the approach flight, the surreal experience of flying at rooftop height over occupied France, the violence of the explosions, the chaos of the German fighter attack, and the grief of learning that Pickard had been killed. They also spoke of pride. Pride in having accomplished a mission that many considered impossible. Pride in having struck a blow against Nazi tyranny. Pride in serving alongside men like Pickard who embodied the best traditions of military leadership. Wing Commander Irving "Black" Smith, who led 487 Squadron's attack on the prison walls, described the raid in a post-war interview as the most challenging and the most meaningful mission I ever flew. We knew that people's lives depended on our accuracy, that if we missed, we would be killing the people we were trying to save. That knowledge concentrated the mind wonderfully. Wing Commander Bob Iredale, who commanded 464 Squadron, spoke of the eerie silence after the attack, as the Mosquitoes turned for home and he realized that Pickard's aircraft was not in formation, that the mission had succeeded but at a terrible cost. The story of Operation Jericho, told and retold in books, documentaries, and memorials, has become part of the larger narrative of World War II. A narrative of courage and sacrifice, of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, of moral choices made under pressure with incomplete information. It stands as a reminder that war is never clean, that even the most precise military operations involve tragic consequences, that victory is often purchased at a price measured in human lives. The men who flew the mission, the prisoners who died in the prison, the prisoners who escaped and survived, all of them were caught in the vast machinery of global conflict, their individual stories subsumed into the grand strategy of armies and nations. Yet their individual stories matter. They remind us that history is not made only by generals and politicians, but by pilots who hold steady at 50 feet altitude while bombs explode beneath them, by resistance fighters who endure torture rather than betray their comrades, by ordinary citizens who shelter fugitives at risk of their own lives. On February 18, 2024, the 80th anniversary of Operation Jericho, ceremonies were held in Amiens and in England to honor the participants and remember the complex legacy of the mission. Descendants of the aircrew, survivors' families, historians, and local officials gathered at memorials to lay wreaths and tell the story once more to a new generation. The passage of 80 years has not simplified the moral complexity of the operation or resolved the debates about its necessity. But it has provided perspective, allowing us to see Operation Jericho not as an isolated event but as a moment in the larger arc of the war. A war that demanded impossible choices, that asked people to risk everything for causes larger than themselves, that tested the limits of courage and endurance and humanity itself. The 19 mosquitoes that flew to Amiens that winter day in 1944, skimming above the ground at what veterans called a suicidal altitude, represented more than a tactical airstrike. They represented a commitment to allies, to the cause of freedom, to the belief that some risks are worth taking even when the cost is measured in blood. That commitment, and the courage required to honor it, is the enduring legacy of Operation Jericho. A legacy that speaks across decades to remind us of what ordinary people can accomplish when history demands the extraordinary.